My name is Danielle Dart, and I coordinate public programs for the Minnesota Historical Society. Welcome to the final lecture in the 2021 Digital History Forum season, during which we have delved into some of the currents that have shaped the United States and complicate its national motto, E Pluribus Unum, which means out of many, one. Tonight, we join Professor Steve Conn of Miami University to explore the roots of the rural-urban divide in America. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that even as we gather to explore the past, we are bearing witness to history on this, the day when a Minneapolis jury declared Derek Chauvin guilty on all counts for the murder of George Floyd. Speaking only for myself, I have found living through history in isolation pretty challenging. But tonight, I have no doubt that people in cities, small towns, and rural places all over America are also bearing witness to the history that continues to unfold here in Minnesota. And as an educator who believes wholly and deeply in the power of learning to change the course of history, I am grateful for the digital space we are sharing together right now. So, the rural-urban divide is one of the nation's oldest political rifts. In 1800, when only 5% of the population lived in cities, Thomas Jefferson envisioned the United States as a republic of yeoman farmers who lived free from the dependencies that cities, which he called sinks of voluntary misery, encouraged in their residents. The idea of rural America as center of virtue persisted long beyond Jefferson's lifetime. In the late 19th century, even as the Industrial Revolution drew millions to cities, one small town booster maintained that rural voters were, quote, superior in morality and self-government. By the 1920s, the balance had shifted and the majority of Americans lived in cities, and sharp-tongued journalist H.L. Mencken was denigrating rural voters as small-town yokels and political serfs. I don't know if he actually talked that way, but that's how I imagine it. And so the battle to declare which interests, rural or urban, should dominate our political discourse and which voters could justifiably claim standing as real Americans has continued. Our speaker tonight is Steve Conn, the W.E. Smith Professor of History at Miami University in Ohio. He is the co-editor of the online magazine Origins, Current Events in Historical Perspective, and the author of Americans Against the City, Anti-Urbanism in the 20th Century. Professor Conn is a returning History Forum speaker. In fact, he delivered one of the History Center's last in-person public programs in the winter of 2020, the barn burner of a lecture about big government. He is also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. So please welcome him back to the History Forum. Welcome, Steve.
Danielle, thank you so much for that introduction. And let me begin by reiterating what you said at the outset. It isn't just those of you in the Twin Cities. We've all been paying attention, and I fully recognize that yours is a community that has been in some turmoil. My son Zachary lives with you in St. Paul. I get reports from him regularly about all of this, and so fingers crossed and hoping that today's verdict actually maybe points us a way forward, and that we can move in a good direction after the waiting and the anxiety that has all caused over the last nearly year since George Floyd's murder. I am also delighted to be back, at least sort of, with you all. I had a wonderful time last February when I came to town and was able to meet with you all in person. It was my last adventure before everything shut down, and I'm really honored to be invited back. So Danielle and all of the people at the History Center who make this possible, thank you very much. I'm really flattered that you've had me back. My task this evening, and Danielle has outlined this very nicely for me already, is to try to put this urban-rural divide in some kind of historical context. That's why you keep historians around, is so that we can put things that are on the front page today in some historical perspective. So that's my task. I'm going to trot through, roughly 200 plus years of history in the next 40 minutes. And so fasten your seatbelts. And I look forward to the questions that you have at the end. Okay, so let me go ahead and start with what seems like a very long time ago, but was in fact just a few months ago, the election of 2020. I think that the most extraordinary one-line summary of the dynamics of that election were captured in this particular phrase: Many of you will remember this. And let me start by saying, I'm from Philadelphia. You're welcome. This was the line that Donald Trump used in one of his debates with Joe Biden. It encapsulated what was maybe the most flamboyantly, extravagantly anti-city presidential campaign that has been run in my reckoning. The extensive and repeated relentless way in which Donald Trump attacked American cities, I think was a way of, it sort of bared this divide that has now opened up in American politics. Bad things happen in Philadelphia was his way of insulting the city. What you're actually looking at there in that image is my daughter, proudly, who goes to college in Philadelphia, proudly wearing this on a sweatshirt. She has informed me that this is now the city's official tourist and marketing slogan because when you're from Philadelphia, bad things happen. And there's really no way you can insult any of us with a line like that. But as I said, what it captured was the fracture that laid bare this sense that there were two Americas, one urban, one rural. It's inflected with all kinds of racial connotations. We can talk about that later as we move forward. So what I want to do today is really, in a sense, explore and untangle a paradox, maybe the central paradox of American life. And it's this: we are a nation of urbanites. 75 to 80% of us now live in metropolitan regions of 500,000 people or more. We are a nation of urbanites. And yet we are filled with people who don't like cities very much at all, and certainly not our own cities. That conundrum, that paradox, that contradiction is what I want to explore with you over the next little while in this lecture. And so let me get started, actually, by taking us back 4 years. I realize it's dinner time and we may not want to revisit all of this, but there's the electoral map of the election of 2016. And you can see that that map is overwhelmingly red. Hillary Clinton won the blue states there, Donald Trump won the red states. If we drill down a little further, we look at that map on a county level, the map gets even redder. Donald Trump overwhelmingly won the geography of the country, but I think many of you will remember the results of this election. Donald Trump won over 2,600 counties, and that's the smallest unit of political counting that we do. Hillary Clinton won fewer than 500. It's a remarkable disparity, and it explains why that map is so red. But you'll remember that she won the popular vote by 3 million. What can we conclude from that? Well, what we can conclude is that Donald Trump won the places where nobody lived, and Hillary Clinton won the places where people did live. Even further, those 487 counties, by anybody's best guess, account for about 60% of the American GDP. So Donald Trump won the places where nobody lives and where economic activity is not nearly as significant. And yet, because of our electoral college system, he wound up, he wound up winning the presidency in the Electoral College, even though he had decisively lost the popular vote. This disparity is in fact baked into our political system and was done so by design. The Electoral College system is there to privilege rural voters, to give them a greater voice in the national system. If we look at the Senate, that is also, those rural votes count more as well. It's what I call the tyranny of Wyoming. There is a lovely shot of Wyoming. Fewer than 600,000 people live in the state of Wyoming. I used to teach at Ohio State University. I think I've taught classes bigger than Wyoming, and yet it gets its 2 senators. You all know this. By comparison, the state of California with its almost 39 million residents, gets exactly 2 senators. So one conclusion to draw from this pretty evidently is that your vote counts more in a rural place than it does in a more urbanized place. And that's, as I said, by design. The founding fathers, as they designed the Constitution, did want to privilege real estate over people. 2016, if we look at the senatorial level, now remember that a third of the Senate, give or take, is up every 2 years. So in those senatorial races in 2016, Democratic candidates won 45.2 million votes total across the country. Republican candidates won, again, about 6 million votes fewer in those races. And the result after that election was a 52-48 Republican majority. This is the way rural politics is privileged. Rural voters are given, the rural votes count more than those in urban areas. So why is that? Well, Danielle has already hinted at this in her lovely introduction. Many of the founders were deeply, deeply suspicious of cities altogether. Jefferson was perhaps the most articulate or extravagant, if you like. Here we have cities compared to some kind of festering cancer on the body of the nation. What the founders are afraid of, and I'll sort of take us back a little bit to concepts of the late 18th century. Cities, London, Paris, are sources of luxury in that 18th century conception of the word. Luxury inevitably leads to corruption. And that's a wonderful word, the way it's used in the late 18th century. If the republic is going to preserve its virtue, it must protect itself from corruption, and corruption is a consequence of urban places. Now, Jefferson, a little hypocritical about this. He loved Paris. He liked London as well. He just didn't think Americans should go there because they might get ideas. As Danielle has already alluded to, he imagined a nation of independent, rurally based yeoman farmers. Yes, of course, white farmers, to be sure. That was the image that Jefferson and others, Madison and so forth, had of the nation. I would argue that really the only founding figure that I'm aware of who was a passionate urbanite was Benjamin Franklin, and we can talk about that more if you like. Jefferson can stand for us emblematically as setting a certain kind of tone, baked into our constitutional system and baked in as well to our cultural attitude. So across the 19th century, if you don't recognize this gentleman, Henry David Thoreau, about the city closest to him, Boston, Thoreau didn't like cities at all, never went to them, didn't like people much at all. But is, again, it's sort of representative of this anti-urban ethos that permeates writers, thinkers, critics, and so forth across the 19th century. Henry Adams, of those Adams, by the way, his grandfather was a president, his great-grandfather was a president, the Massachusetts Adams is. Henry Adams, in his wonderful autobiography, The Education, sets this up, I think, quite wonderfully early on and he writes this at the turn of the 20th century. He sets this up quite wonderfully, drawing this contrast between the city of Boston and the small farm village of Quincy on the outskirts of Boston. Quincy had always been right. It represented a moral principle. And what is that principle? Resistance to the city. This anti-urban attitude, this notion that America really belongs in the country, as I said, runs deep in the culture and the politics through the 19th century. So let's get us up to 1900. The image you see on the right there is the Lower East Side of Manhattan, crowded now, especially with all kinds of newly arrived immigrants. By 1900, the largest 200 cities in the country contained over a third of us and 2/3 of our industrial production. When we think about the turn of the 20th century as that moment of enormous industrial expansion, the arrival of industrial capitalism. And we think about steel plants in Pittsburgh, and we think about automobile plants in Detroit, and we think about industrial scale milling operations in Minneapolis. All of that industrial development is urban. The economy has shifted dramatically to the nation's urban centers. And one thing we can conclude here is that, well, people like Jefferson and Thoreau and Henry Adams and dozens of others kept chiding us all that we should go back to the country. Americans nodded their heads and they took off for the city. The concentration, that trend line from 1790 forward is towards increasing urbanization, decade after decade after decade after decade. One of those anti-urbanists I find quite fascinating was the Congregationalist minister Josiah Strong. He himself loathed cities for many of the reasons I'll describe in a moment. But in an essay he writes just there in 1898, he announces that the problem of the 20th century is going to be the problem of the city. Now, those of you who know your Du Bois, your W.E.B. Du Bois, will hear a sort of echo there. Du Bois writes that the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. He writes that in 1903. 5 years earlier, Josiah Strong, and I think presciently, says the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the city and what to do about it. Okay. So what's wrong with cities? I like cities. Probably many of you like cities. What is it that's at the root of this anti-urbanism now here in the early 20th century? If we've sort of moved away from those 18th century notions of luxury, what's wrong with American cities? You're looking at an image of Chicago from the lake back onto Michigan Avenue right around the turn of the 20th century. Well, let me offer two pieces of this anti-urbanism. The first is what people referred to as concentration in the early years of the 20th century. What we would describe today as density. That is to say, too many people crowded into too small a space. Worse than that, the wrong kind of people. The city in 1900 is filled now with everything except white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who at this point have decided that they constitute what really is America. They are immigrants now from places like Italy, Sicily, Greece, Poland, Lithuania. Many of them are Catholics, not Protestants. Worse, those who aren't Catholics are Jews. And the anti-Semitism of the late 19th century and early 20th century is casual and common and really quite hair-raising when you're reading in the writings that are published at that time. So we don't like those people. And those people are now concentrated in cities. Too many of them in too small a space. We don't like that. The second piece of this anti-urbanism is that cities can only function now with the active participation of government. Think about it for a moment. These big industrial cities grow very big, very quickly. And so in order to make life work, government has to step in. City government, sometimes state government. Here's Benjamin Marsh, a progressive reformer from 1908. Government must prevent what charity can only mitigate. Government steps in to make urban life livable. The image you see here from the city of Philadelphia, from right around, it's just before the First World War, is of a sewer project. It's not particularly sexy, but think about it for a moment. All of these millions now of people crowded into New York or Chicago or Philadelphia or Cleveland, now they have clean water into their apartments. Their sewage is disposed of in a sanitary way, paved streets, electricity, street lights. All of this makes urban life possible. And it all comes because of the role, the active role of government. This is in some ways the moment when the experience of urbanites and rural residents really begins to diverge. Let me give you an example of that. 1877, 2/3 of all Philadelphians were relieving themselves in an outhouse, living in the city. They were getting their water from a pump in some public area. By the First World War, that's not true anymore. The outhouses are obsolete. The water comes up into your apartment. People living out in rural areas, still using the outhouse, still using the pump. City governments make possible a modernization, in some ways making life easier, more sanitary, safer than it is in rural areas. This divergent experience now that urbanites and rural residents have, I think also fuels this friction, this divide that we're here to talk about. These folks who object to the role of government are suspicious of government altogether, because government, which in their terms equals somehow collective action, would seem to be the opposite, would seem to erode and threaten American individuality. Americans are individualists. We should do these things individually. When we do them collectively, that somehow isn't really American. They're not wrong, these critics, because municipal spending in the big industrial cities grows dramatically in the early decades of the 20th century for all kinds of things, as I've already suggested, everything from sewer systems to city beautiful projects like you see here, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia, built in the years right after the First World War. I rhapsodize with my students sometimes about the miracle of indoor plumbing. They don't quite get it, but I try to persuade them that the internet really is as nothing compared to the virtues of indoor plumbing. You can go for a week without your cell phone, but you go for a week without your indoor plumbing and you come talk to me about it. This is what happens in cities, and it says not happening in rural places. Rural people are still lighting their houses with kerosene. They're still using an outhouse. They're still pumping water out of a well, while urbanites have all of these modern conveniences now because of the role of government. America's urban moment arrives, I would say, in the 1920s. And it's not simply because at that moment, the federal census announces that a majority of us now reside in urban places. So that graph line that started in 1790 and has simply continued, we've now, that milestone in 1920, a majority, 50+% of us are now urban residents. At the same time, American culture itself becomes increasingly nationalized and increasingly urbanized, so that the venues, the mechanisms of a mass culture and a consumer culture are all urban driven. First and foremost, maybe the radio, which is now which proliferates across households in the 1920s. The first commercial radio broadcast actually takes place in 1920. These are you would tune into the radio, maybe listen to a local station, or maybe you would listen to a station affiliated with a nationally reaching radio network like the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, or the National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC. We think of these as TV networks. Nowadays, they start off as radio networks. Nationally circulating magazines, urban-based, Saturday Evening Post published in Philadelphia, just to take a wonderful example from the 1920s. So even if you are living now in a rural place, what you are increasingly surrounded by culturally is urban generated and urban focused. You might be out there somewhere, I don't know, in the middle of Minnesota, and you've tuned into one of those radio affiliates, and what you're listening to now is jazz being broadcast live from the Cotton Club in Harlem. This becomes the experience now, increasingly American culture, mass culture, dominated now by urban production. This is also the same moment, and here we are with Sinclair Lewis, when the intelligentsia, many of them at any rate, launched an attack against the small town from which many of them had come, against those rural values, that rural life. Sinclair Lewis, Minnesota's own, won the first Nobel Prize awarded to an American in literature for his eviscerating portrayals of the small town stultifying life that in places like, well, Gopher Prairie, Minnesota. The village virus, which he describes wonderfully in that novel, it's infectious, it's toxic, it makes people mean and small-minded. And this is, as I said, the portrayal now of rural. H.L. Mencken, Danielle already mentioned Mencken, wonderful that she brought him up. Newspaper editor in Baltimore, also the editor of this literary magazine called The Smart Set. And if that doesn't capture the contrast, urbanites are sophisticated, they're cosmopolitan, they're erudite and educated. Small town people now are backward. They are reactionary, and they have missed the modernizing boat. That's the divide now in the 1920s. It became the subject of a national, indeed international episode in 1925. You know the story. State of Tennessee passes a law essentially forbidding the teaching of Darwinian evolution in public high school classrooms. John Scopes in the tiny town of Dayton, Tennessee, teaches Darwin, or maybe does. He's arrested, he's put on trial, and this becomes an enormous allegory between the forces of progress and the forces of reaction, the forces of the urban intellectual versus the traditional and often religious values. There's Mencken, who came down to cover this trial. It was covered nationally on the radio, nationally syndicated through these publications now, circulating nationally. So it wasn't just an episode taking place in a little corner of Tennessee, or as Mencken calls it, a forlorn backwater of Tennessee. Here is the urban-rural contrast in its sharpest, most allegorical way. I would note, for those of you that may forget, Darwin loses this case. Scopes, of course, is convicted of breaking the law, and in the wake of that loss, 9 other states, mostly in the South, passed laws just like Tennessee's, forbidding the teaching of Darwin. Now it's been upheld by a court. And so we should go careful exactly about which direction the vectors are pointing here. Darwin lost that trial, and other states wound up passing their own anti-Darwin laws as a consequence. Okay, so if the 1920s constitutes the urban-rural friction coming to a boil, let me look at the way in which anti-urban people reacted against the city. And I summarize this in the one word here, a movement to decentralize America's urban places, to literally take people and production and move them out as a way of trying to decrease that concentration, trying to get people back out into the country where Americans belong. That remains that cultural value rooted again in those long, long traditions from the 18th and 19th century. Let's take a look at this. It's a return, really. We see this in lots of magazine pieces, in conferences and so forth, to an agrarian ideal, a myth, if you will. Here's Patrick Quinn, professor at Northwestern University, and look again at the language here. Agriculture is individualistic, that's good. Urban life is cooperative, that's bad. Never mind what you might have learned in kindergarten or on Sesame Street. In these terms, in these ideological terms, being cooperative is a bad thing. Being individualistic is a good thing. In 1932, the decentralization impulse got an enormous boost with the election of Franklin Roosevelt. As the Depression was cratering towards its bottom, Roosevelt is elected, and Roosevelt, I've taken the quote there you see is from the title of the first biography that had ever been written about Roosevelt, referring to him simply as a country squire. Roosevelt hated cities too. He was absolutely part of that anti-urban tradition. He lived up on his own estate up on the Hudson River. He thought cities were unnecessary. He didn't like them very much. And one thing we ought to remember is that when we think about Roosevelt's New Deal, we should reckon with the fact that much of it, maybe most of it, was really designed to save and revive rural America. Roosevelt didn't pay much attention to American cities. Let me just rattle off a couple of these things: the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the Civilian Conservation Course, agricultural extension offices, soil conservation efforts, much of which is still on the landscape today. Windbreaks that the New Deal helped plant on big open spaces out in farm country. What Roosevelt imagined was that the New Deal, he could put the power of government to restore rural America to what he felt was its rightful place in American life. His resettlement administration, and pause over that for just a moment, an entire New Deal agency whose first task was to resettle, was designed to move people out of the cities and into, in this case, a series of nearly 24 rural towns. Now, ultimately, only 3 of them got built. You're looking here on the left at Greendale, Wisconsin, which was on the fringe of Milwaukee when it was built, and on the right, a plan map of Green Hills, Ohio, about 45 minutes from where I'm standing right now, just outside of Cincinnati. It's now been swallowed up by a ring road and so forth, but it was out in the country. The Civilian Conservation Corps, many of you may know this, was designed literally to take unemployed urban men, 18 to 25 years old, and move them out into the country where they would plant trees and do soil erosion projects and put trails in national parks. Roosevelt believed this was good, both in an economic sense, but also, as I've said, in a kind of moral sense as well. The New Deal is a decentralizing project. During the same time, during the same period, this interwar period, we can see the rise of a certain kind of rural nostalgia. And here, some of you may have been to this particular village outside of Detroit in Dearborn, Michigan. This is Henry Ford's Greenfield Village, an open-air museum, an ersatz village, where Henry Ford accumulated the buildings associated with famous people or famous events. He bought them from all over the country and then shipped them to Dearborn, where he created this weird town that you can walk through. What's fascinating about Ford's Greenfield Village, of course, is that he collected from the 19th century. What interested him was the pre-industrial, the rural, the agrarian, all of the things that his own car company had helped to destroy. Ford knew this. Ford recognized the way in which his own Model T was going to transform America's landscape. And in some ways, he's sort of, this is like a salvage project for him. The very first building he bought for Greenfield, what became Greenfield Village, was his own family's farmstead in rural Michigan. In 1919, he heard that it was going to be torn down, yes, for a road widening project. And so he bought it, brought it to Greenfield Village, and it became this, part of this ersatz village. We've all read these books. My children read these books. My sisters loved these books. But it's worth remembering that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a rabidly conservative anti-New Dealer who was offered these books to the children of America as an antidote to the modernizing, urbanizing world, which she found so appalling. This is her look back on her own childhood in the late 19th century as a model for what Americans really ought to live like. It's not that she suggested we should live like this right now, but she offered it as this sort of gauzy, nostalgia-filled world of sweetness and light where people looked out, your families were looked out for one another, you overcame adversity. There are the real Ma and Pa in a 19th century photograph there. This too, part of this anti-urban reaction in the 1930s. In fact, it's a nostalgia like with Ford's Village that never, for a past that never really existed in the first place. Life was not so great out there in the little house on the prairie. The Ingalls begin their farmsteading experiences in Minnesota, as I'm sure many of you know, after federal troops have cleared out the native population. But in fact, they fail. Pa, as it turns out, is a terrible farmer. That the family found themselves on the move, in debt, unstable. It was not that story of kind of rootedness and rural values and so forth. It was peripatetic, it was marginal and transient, and nonetheless, it got repackaged by Laura Ingalls Wilder into this, as I said, deeply sentimental, deeply nostalgic product, which continues to have an enormous valence in American life. Certainly, in the 1970s, when it became the subject of this very popular, and again, many of you remember this, long-running TV series, while we still celebrated that world of yeoman farmers, independent yeoman farmers out there on the prairie, living their life and making a future for themselves. 1939, World's Fair in New York City. On the far edge of Flushing in Queens, Americans came to see what they called the world of tomorrow. And there you see the symbol of that fair, what was called the Trilon and Perisphere. I don't think those words actually are real, but that was the marketing campaign for the 1939 World's Fair. And when you went to the World's Fair in New York, almost undoubtedly, you went to see the Futurama exhibit. It was the most popular fair, exhibit at the fair. You can see in the image there the lines of people waiting to get into the Futurama. Futurama, what people went to see, was an extraordinary projection of what the city was going to look like in 1960, 20 years in the future. Right? It was a dazzling operation. Give you a sense of the scale of the Futurama exhibit. You can see some of the workers putting together this imaginary city. It really was a big exhibit. When you bought a ticket, you got to sit in one of these banquette seats. It was really cool. And then that level of seating would rotate so that you could look down on this imaginary city from up high. You got like a God's eye view of this city from those seats. And what you saw was a city decentralized, cleared out, cleaned up, no more concentration of people. Look at that image there. There are no people at all except the ones driving those tiny little cars. Tall buildings, big roads. That's the city as it was imagined by the decentralizers in 1960. They're on display in the 1939 New York World's Fair. Okay. Pause because of this Second World War. When the war is over, this impulse, this image, this goal is carried out in the post-war city as cities are decentralized. And they're decentralized with two primary pieces of federal policy. First, urban renewal. Urban renewal was started its life initially as a housing project to try to deal with the really severe shortage of housing in the post-war period. All these GIs coming back, getting married, having babies, and there hasn't been any new housing built, not during the Depression and not during the war. It starts off its life as the Housing Act. That's President Truman's goal for the 1949 Housing Act, a decent home in a decent environment. And there is a key. Urban renewal is supercharged in 1954 with another piece of legislation, and now the courts have ruled governments can use the right of eminent domain to seize property if it is deemed to be blighted, a loaded word to be sure, and this is what cities then went ahead and did, as you can see in the image. They began to use urban renewal money to tear down some of those old neighborhoods. Too many people, too many of the wrong kind of people living in those places, clear them out, clean them up. Eventually, by the late 50s and 60s, institutions were using urban renewal money, institutions like hospitals and universities. If you've ever been to Lincoln Center in New York, that's an urban renewal project. That used to be a very densely populated little corner of Midtown Manhattan, cleared out and made way for that modernist plaza and the concert halls that go along with it. But again, it removes the people. Your cities are no strangers to urban renewal. You're looking at the Gateway section of Minneapolis there from an old photograph. You see the streetcar in the lower right-hand corner, which is quite wonderful. 22 square blocks raised through urban renewal programs, over 200 buildings, including some really quite wonderful, I've seen the pictures, really quite wonderful examples of late 19th century American architecture. And it was replaced, at least for a long time, as many of you I'm sure know, with that. Now I recognize the Gateway area of the city has been redeveloped more recently, but for a long time in the mid 20th century, that's what urban renewal got you. And not just in the Twin Cities, I don't want to pick on them. There's the government center in Boston on the right-hand side, and that's what it looked like before urban renewal. So you can see the difference. Crowded, busy, dense, lively, dead, sterile, ugly, somewhat threatening. You lived in the Boston area for a while years ago, and my friends and I would walk around government center, even if it was a longer distance, because we simply didn't want to cross over this plaza because it was so lifeless and so depressing. So city after city after city cleared itself out, replaced what used to be there with these kinds of projects. People at the time saw what was going on. Here's the wonderful journalist William White reminding us that urban renewal was being carried out by people who just didn't like cities very much. And there it is, right? That this is the anti-urban tradition that we've been examining, and now they've got money and bulldozers to take care of. You're looking here at this is Boston's West End being torn down. Immigrant neighborhood, filled at this point largely with elderly, Italian and Irish people. Clear it out. The second piece of this decentralization program happens in 1956 when Dwight Eisenhower signs really the most significant piece of domestic legislation during his administration, the Interstate Highway Act, which authorized 42,000 miles of interstate highway. Multi-lane, high-speed, limited access, free. And this is a map from 1958 of the interstate system as it was proposed. And you see it's pretty close to what finally got built. What you notice here, right, is that here's Minneapolis, St. Paul, if you can see my arrow. These highways connected various cities. So there's Des Moines and there's Chicago, but they're mostly used not for that long distance driving, but to enable people to leave the city easily, quickly, and at high speed. It facilitated the move of population out of these cities as this system began to get built. Let's go back to St. Paul for just a moment. And this is a story some of you may know. This is the Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul. And this is what it looked like before the highway project. This is what it looked like when the highways arrived. And here we are today. What I'd ask you to notice is the way when you take this aerial photograph, what you really see is the way in which these highways run like enormous scars across the fabric of the city. The fabric of the city is torn in half. It's torn into pieces, and it's very difficult now. I'm sure you've had this experience to negotiate from one side of the highway to the other. It's inhospitable. You have to do it in a car. It cuts off one neighborhood from the next. As I said, it takes the integrity of that urban fabric and it shreds it. And again, I don't want to just pick on the Twin Cities here. I'm about 50 miles from that. You're looking at downtown Cincinnati, the west end of Cincinnati. To say that these road projects went through neighborhoods that were primarily poor and primarily Black almost goes without saying. But yes, the west end of Cincinnati was a historically Black section of the city, torn out and replaced. There's the Ohio River here, right? And replaced with this. This is a piece of I-75. Notice when you look at this slide at just how much space is involved in the center of your city, right next to downtown. How many acres are now devoted to driving through the city rather than benefiting what goes on inside the city through these highway projects? And again, this is now what the American urban landscape looks like. I no longer remember where those slides are from because it doesn't matter. They could be Atlanta, could be Dallas, could be Phoenix, could be Los Angeles. It all looks approximately the same. And again, I would ask you to think about the amount of space that is gobbled up in urban areas by these large scale road projects, which both clear out what was there and make it easier for people to leave. This is Los Angeles. From some years ago. And I just want to make the point or drive the point home. It looks an awful lot like Futurama. That decentralizing impulse that really began to percolate in the 1920s and 30s comes to fruition in the post-war decades. And the results are easily measurable. Right here on the left-hand side are population figures from the 1950 census from some of America's largest cities. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia are the three largest. There's Minneapolis at 522,000 in 1950. And then look at the population drop, almost 1 million in New York, more than 500,000 in Chicago, and on we go. 150,000 people fewer now in Minneapolis by 1980. And as a percentage of the total, that's really pretty dramatically high. So these projects have their intended or maybe unintended consequence of clearing these cities out. There are fewer people who now live in them altogether. Of course, it also generates what historians have documented as the urban crisis, increasing racial tensions as these neighborhoods, especially poor Black neighborhoods, are torn apart and rejiggered and thrown into turmoil. Culminating symbolically in the mid-1970s when New York barely escapes municipal bankruptcy. There, of course, is that famous New York Daily News front page when President Ford announced he would not bail the city out. That's 1975. 2 years later, those Americans watching the World Series between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the New York Yankees, Game 2 in Yankee Stadium, heard Howard Cosell broadcast live to the whole country as he looked up out of his broadcast booth, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx are burning." What he saw off in the distance were a series of abandoned and empty buildings that had been set on fire. That was now where American cities had gotten to by the late 1970s as a kind of end product of 2 decades, almost 3 decades worth of decentralization. So did it work, at least as far as rural advocates were concerned? Well, no, not really. In fact, rural America, farm America, is also in a steep decline in the years after the Second World War. Not only the sheer number of farms, but the farming population. There's the University of Minnesota's sociologist George Donahue in 1968, recognizing that Jeffersonian ideal is now a long ago myth by the late 1960s. So here you can see, if you follow my arrow here we are at the start of the Second World War, and then just look at the drop of the number of farms in America to 1980. So no, in fact, rural America isn't benefiting here in the way that people imagined it might. And with that, we see economic stagnation. Here again, a banker at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Branch, James Herder, in 1968, small towns, they just stagnate. By 1959, farm subsidies are the second largest piece of the federal budget. It's a distant second to defense, but nonetheless, it reminds us of the extent to which rural America has to be subsidized in order to survive. Incomes are flat and they are not keeping up with incomes in metropolitan regions, and on it goes. In fact, rural America has been in a crisis, well, more often than not for the last 75 years. Ironic, too, that rural places are more and more dependent on federal money. When you look at states, if you look at the balance of payments, that is to say, the amount of money states send into Washington in the form of taxes versus the amount of money they get back from Washington in the forms of program, the states with the greatest imbalance there are all rural states, starting with the state of Kentucky, which gets much more money back. I think it's something like $1.15 for every dollar it sends to Washington in the form of taxes. Never mind the irony of Kentucky's 2 senators with this as well. By the 1980s, rural America, farm America had become a charity case. You may remember the Farm Aid, the first of these concerts, these benefit concerts that took place in the fall of 1985. They've become annual events. Farm Aid is still going on. The idea here was to respond to the farming crisis of the 1980s by helping people save the family farm. It was simply too little against much larger forces. Cities started to come back by the 1990s. And when we look most recently, cities certainly took a hit during the Great Recession, but so did rural areas. Cities have bounced back to a great degree. Rural areas have not. You're looking here at the farmers market on a Saturday at Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, and increasingly rural America starts to look like this. I teach at Miami University, which is centrally located in between the corn and soybean fields, and I drive a fair distance here to campus through several towns that look approximately like this, what I call landscapes of loss. There's an old farmstead in Minnesota. You've seen these. As farming gets more and more consolidated, little farmhouses like that just sit in the middle of the fields, and then they fall apart and they sag and they deteriorate until eventually they fall down altogether. Main Street, well, you remember what that banker at the Fed said. They don't disappear, they just stagnate. And main streets in rural small towns, you can find some combination of abandoned, empty storefronts, antique shops, and maybe some social service agencies. Nostalgia may be in the 1930s, elegy by the late 20th century, and certainly in the early years of the 21st century. I want to introduce you, if you don't know him, to one of my favorite poets, Iowa's own Ted Kooser, and I'm just going to roll through for you the last stanza of his wonderful poem, Abandoned Farmhouse. Something went wrong, says the empty house. And I'll just let you read these. Not nostalgic, really. But elegiac, to be sure. This now has become the way we think about rural America. In some ways, rural America has become that inner city we were so scared of in the 1960s and 70s. Population loss, economic decline, and all of the social consequences that come with that, most spectacularly, most tragically, of course, drug addictions. When we think about the opioid crisis, and I am surrounded by it. Southwest Ohio is the epicenter of that. This is a rural phenomenon, bringing with it both human misery, but also crime and violence, and all the rest of it. The salmon-colored and red dots you see there are counties that have lost population recently. What you see there again in the red, salmon-colored, are counties, rural counties that have not recovered from the job losses of the Great Recession in 2007. So what you can see more and more is the increasing concentration towards metropolitan areas that I started this lecture off with. Minnesota is a microcosm of all of this. You're looking there at some census numbers from 2010, 2015 in the map. And what you can see is that half of the state's counties lost population. There are, I've listed for you the 5 biggest losers, at least by percentage. They're all rural. The counties that are growing, as you're fully aware, are in the Twin Cities metropolitan region. Other places, so even as the nation is doing exactly what Minnesota is doing in that sense, as more and more people concentrate in the urban core, leaving rural places increasingly abandoned. And yet, I'll leave you with Gary Wills, the wonderful historian and writer, who I think captures our anti-urban sensibility wonderfully in this quote from 20 years ago. We are still a nation that does not like its cities, even though we are unarguably an urbanized nation. So thank you very much. If you're interested, I've written a book on this topic. I'm really excited to take your questions. I'm sorry that we can't do it a little more personally, but again, thank you for sharing your evening with me. I'll come out of the slides, and there we are.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much. We have some fantastic questions for you, a lot of questions. I think the most we've gotten in the 4 lectures that we've had so far. So we're going to start with Jim G. He asks you to talk about the role of prohibition and the role it played in this particular sort of rural urban narrative.
Yeah, so prohibition is pushed by an interesting political coalition. It includes, interestingly, feminists who are convinced that prohibition is going to be good for women, because who gets drunk? Men. And what do they do when they're drunk? Well, they tend to beat their children and their wives. But part of that coalition included religious conservatives, Protestant religious conservatives. And in that sense, it is rooted with this. There's a whole other story here about the revival of fundamentalist Christianity in the early 20th century. Prohibition is part of that, and fundamentalism is primarily a rural phenomenon. It's the 1920s where the Bible Belt is first coined as a phrase. So I think prohibition does play a role in this, because rural people, religiously conservative, religious fundamentals, see alcohol as part of those urban corruptions that they're upset with. And if we can control that, we'll all be better off.
Which is interesting, because in Minnesota, that one of the the counties that was most active in bootlegging was Stearns County, which is
sure. Well, yeah. and you know, out where I'm
that's
from,
where the grain was.
well, exactly, and where I'm standing right now, of course, it's over the river in Kentucky and West Virginia. So even as they were voting for prohibition, they were, you know, they were distilling the moonshine in the backyard. Absolutely.
Monica and Mike have sort of interwoven questions about why. So they're both thinking about that decentralization, urban renewal, the construction of highways like Highway 94 through the Rondo neighborhood. why did people in cities buy into
Yeah.
these mindsets? And the sort of attendant question is, how did people like, say, Robert Moses of New York, or big advocates of that, how did their arguments gain traction? What helped them get that support?
It's a great question. So I'll say a couple of things. Urban renewal did generate some political opposition. Highway projects, by and large, did not. And I think there's a significant reason for that. Urban renewal money came through the mayor's office. So if you wanted to stop an urban renewal project that was going to take place, you knew exactly where you had to march. You went to your city council person, you went to the mayor's office. That's where the buck stopped. These highway projects were all managed by state departments of transportation. They were, in some sense, not accountable. Nobody was accountable democratically for how those projects went. So these road planners didn't have to face any opposition. And if there was any opposition, they didn't have to respond to it. And a lot of these guys, I mean, I had this wonderful map I saw in Colorado, where these guys literally just took rulers and said, okay, what's the shortest distance between these 2 points? Well, there's a town in the middle of that. We'll just get rid of it. And they didn't have to worry about pleasing a constituency in the way that a mayor's office did. Why did people buy into this? Well, I think it is hard to overestimate how much Americans love to drive and how much they would rather drive than anything else. I had a friend who worked on the very first subway project in Los Angeles, and this was now 25 years ago. The public approval for that project, when they were raising the money for it, was through the roof. They did these surveys, these polls, and nobody could quite understand. This is Los Angeles, right? And so they drilled down a little bit to try to figure out, why were people so supportive of the subway? And the answer overwhelmingly was, well, if other people ride the subway, my drive is going to be a lot easier, right? So that's I think the way. If you're promising me a faster commute, a faster way to get from one part of the city to another, road projects have, certainly in those years after the Second World War, they really did have broad support. I think nowadays, right, I think starting in the 80s and 90s, we've been much more critical of how these road projects go, what they've done. There have been several high-profile examples of roads that have actually been pulled out of cities, like in Milwaukee, for example, as a way of trying to heal neighborhoods that had otherwise been ripped apart. But yeah, we love our roads. And if you would just get out of my way, I could drive a little faster.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about suburbs and exurbs in this. So Kathy wants to know about how you see the historical role of the expansion of suburbs in playing out in the midst of this rural urban story.
So that's another great question. And this is a research adventure that I'm in the middle of right now. We all know, I think, the phrase white flight. So when I gave you those population numbers between 1950 and 1980, I think we all understand that all of those people who used to live in New York City moved out to Long Island, and all of the people who used to live in Minneapolis moved out to the suburbs of the Twin Cities. But those numbers don't actually add up. Suburbs grow at a much faster rate than city population declines. And the people who are filling up the suburbs are actually rural migrants. They're leaving rural places. They're not getting as far as the center of Minneapolis. They're getting to the suburbs of Minneapolis, because that's where bigger job opportunities, educational opportunities are going to be. So I think in the 1950s and 60s, what you see in particular is this mixing of white suburbanites, some of whom have come from the central city and some of whom have come from the farm. And that's how suburbs are growing in those initial decades.
And that plays into Sue's question, which is, are the sprawling suburbs and exurbs rural, or are they urban?
Yeah, another fantastic question. So there is an official census designation that defines what a city is, what a metropolitan region is, and there is no official designation for what rural is. Rural, according to the census, is anything that isn't metropolitan. And so the question here puts the finger exactly on this definitional problem. You know it when you see it, but there's no statistical way that people agree on to define it. It's not like a population density or a, how many acres per whatever. And I think that's part of why rural exists in our imagination, at least as much as a real place, because there is no official way to define it. We all get to live with it in our heads. I would also say that one of the things that that leads, I think, to some of this urban-rural friction is that rural places, by definition, almost always change into something else. It becomes a suburb. It becomes a city itself. It goes back to whatever it was. And urban places generally don't change in the same profound way. Yes, cities change all the time, but it's still a city, right? So so that shop I used to go to isn't there anymore, but a different shop is. The restaurant I used to like has closed because they retired, but somebody has opened up something new. Whereas in rural places, what people experience is a really profound change from what was to what is. And I think that's part of why rural people can be as distressed as they sometimes are.
And that gets us to, we have a lot of questions about rural areas. And so Mary is sort of pushing back at the idea of that you talked about, the rhetoric of the rural America as the place of the independence, the individual.
Yeah.
She says actual farming, as she understands, is a very cooperative venture. Bargaining a fair price for grain occurs through cooperative, modernization, rural arrows through the government intervention. So how do you see that? Like, there's often a disconnect, we know, between rhetoric and reality.
Yep. Yeah. So I guess I would say, let's go back to the Ingalls for just a moment. People who were out there homestead farming in Minnesota in the post-Civil War era were tied inextricably to urban markets and to urban technologies. And so farming in this country has never been that self-sufficient project that Jefferson imagined. It's always been about larger markets. And that was why we built the canals in the 1830s, and that's why we built the railroads across the continent in the 1860s. So in that sense, I think that rhetoric of individuality and self-sufficiency is really mythic. I think that part of the problem comes, right, is that farmers find themselves, right, they are cooperative perhaps within their own community, but it becomes very difficult to see their interests beyond that. And I think that's where farming has often run into a lot of trouble, right? I mean, we saw this in the 1880s during the farm crisis of that decade, where farm prices kept dropping and people's response was to produce more and more, because that's the only way an individual farmer could imagine making more money, but collectively that just kept forcing the prices even lower. And so that generated, the populist movement of the 1880s and 90s, as farmers are kind of desperate to figure out a way out of that trap. But yeah, I really do think that in this country, rural areas, farming areas have been an extension of urban marketplaces. And this is everything from where you sell your wheat to the Sears and Roebuck catalog that you buy your stuff from, to the McCormick Reaper that you bought from, which is manufactured in Chicago.
And I think that's a perfect lead into Clara's question, which is a wonderfully Minnesota question because it refers to Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution. He was from Iowa, but he studied at U of M. Does the concept of factory farming, which resulted in the loss of the American small family farm, come from urban or rural ideology? And did Borlaug's Green Revolution contribute?
So,
to this
yeah,
stagnation?
right. So I wouldn't say that it's, so that's a two-parter. Let me address the first part first. The One of the stories I think we have to start telling ourselves is to rethink what we mean by Rust Belt and deindustrialization. I live in the Rust Belt. Minneapolis is on the edge of the Rust Belt, at least as it's defined. Industries like automaking and steel may have declined, but agriculture industrialized, and it started, of course, with plants, and more recently has been about animals. And that's why we call them factory farms, right? So we've really seen the industrialization of large areas of farm country in the last, let's call it 50 years, give or take. I'm not sure that that's an urban or rural ideology. I think that's a logic of capitalism ideology, that what you achieve, just like with Henry Ford's River Rouge plant and the Model T, are economies of scale. And insofar, again, as you are, when you're growing wheat, you are participating in an international commodities market. And therefore, if you can produce more for less, that positions you more advantageously in that market. And I think that's really what drives this, is that sort of logic of capital accumulation. It's a great question. Oh,
So,
and Borland, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Revolution. Look, I only know a little bit about the Green Revolution as it played out in places like Mexico. So I don't know what effect that really might have had on rural America. It's a great question. I just don't know. I've never come across that.
And I know its impact mostly internationally, so I can't speak to it either. Joe has an interesting question, because one of the things you said in your opening, one of your early slides, was that idea of cities being associated with those people, the wrong kinds of people, which is often about race, ethnicity, religious diversity. Historic demographics aside, he says, is the rural-urban divide in Minnesota nuanced? Or is it getting more complicated with, given that many of our small towns are seeing an uptick in population and workforce coming through immigrants and refugees of color?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so I will answer that by saying I'm a historian, and so I only have to worry about things that happened long ago. But I think you are seeing a transformation of certain corners of rural America precisely by immigrants and refugees, will sort of keep those people together. So the town of Storm Lake, Iowa, just to take an example across the border, is the home to a big meat processing plant. I forget what the company who owns it is, and it is now home. I mean, I think the population of the town is verging on 50% Latino, and this has created certain kinds of social stresses, but it has also mostly created all kinds of opportunities. Like the schools now have kids, and the schools once upon a time were on the verge of closing because they didn't have any kids. And Main Street now has shops again, and all of that kind of stuff. I think that immigrants are the future of rural America if we really want to get serious about it, because I didn't tell the story in the lecture, but when cities begin to recover from the urban crisis of the 60s and 70s, what happens before those bearded guys with the kale chips and the artisanal beer show up are immigrants who move into certain neighborhoods, stabilize those neighborhoods. Often they open businesses in those neighborhoods. And you see this in Brooklyn, you see this in Washington, D.C., you see this probably in the Twin Cities, though I don't know that case as well. So before there were hipsters, there were immigrants. That's what rural America needs. Rural America is not holding on to its young people. When we look at those demographics about population loss, if you look at it in terms of age cohort, it's really dramatically bad. It's old people who stay, and it's young people who leave. So if you want to reinvigorate these places, you're going to need immigrants. It's the irony here, right? Or the tragedy, if you want, is that those are the places where hostility to immigration really overboiled in the last 4 or 5 years. And so if you're an immigrant, you're going to think twice about going to a place which has been so hostile to the very notion of immigration in the first place.
I'm going to try to finish with the question that's really kind of a synthesis of a lot of questions. Is a lot of people are pointing out what they're noticing in your talk is that, again, that reality versus rhetoric and that division that is so persistent in the rhetoric, but that is at odds with some of the realities of where funding goes, who lives where. So my supposition is that somebody benefits, that somebody has benefited from that division over time. And so what would you say sort of in general?
Yeah, why do we cling to this in the face of the evidence? Right. So that's a tricky proposition. My own sense of this is that there may be ways in which this gets deployed for certain kinds of very specific political advantages, right? So that's what Sarah Palin was up to in 2008 when she talked about real Americans here in the small town in North Carolina during that speech she gave in that campaign. But I also think that there is, I don't know, there's something in the national culture where this is what we celebrate. We do not sing songs of our cities. We go to Europe and we love to walk down the streets of Paris or Vienna. But when we come back to Minneapolis, we lock our doors and we don't quite appreciate the urban spaces that we have. I think it's an almost psychological need that this fills for people, that somehow the small town, white picket fence, that's really where I would rather live.
Well, thank you for this wonderful lecture and for answering all these questions. We have a ton more, but we want to make sure that people can go on with their evenings. Exactly. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who were here tonight and for all of you who asked questions. I am very much hoping that when the forum comes back in the fall, we will be in person together in the 3M auditorium at the Minnesota History Center, and I will be able to actually see all of your faces. So thanks everybody and have a great night.
Thank you all very much.